The great hall of the railway station was a world of its own. It wasn't quiet, not for a second, but its sounds had a rhythm. The deep, echoing voice announcing departures, the slap-slap of hurried footsteps on marble, the rolling thunder of suitcase wheels, and underneath it all, the low hum of 1,000 separate conversations. People flowed through the space like a fast-moving river, their eyes fixed on screens, on signs, on the faces of loved ones they were meeting. They were all going somewhere. He was not. He sat on a cold, polished stone bench, wedged between a giant advertisement for a tropical beach and a tall, green metal trash bin. He was a man in his middle years, though a hard life had a way of adding extra layers, making him look older. His coat was a thick, worn thing, the color of mud, and it was too big for his thin frame. A faded blue backpack, lumpy with all his worldly possessions, rested between his feet. He didn't beg. He didn't hold out a cup. He simply sat, still as a statue, while the river of people parted and flowed around him. His eyes, a pale, watery blue, watched the crowd without really seeing any single person. They were fixed on a point somewhere in the distance, or perhaps somewhere in the past. His name was not important to the Russian world. To the station police, he was a regular they moved along with a tired sigh. To the coffee stall vendor, he was the man who sometimes had enough coins for the cheapest, smallest brew, which he'd cradle for an hour. Today, he had no coins. Today, the hollow feeling in his stomach was a deep, gnawing pit. He'd felt it grow from a whisper in the morning to a constant, demanding roar by late afternoon. He watched as a child, bundled in a bright red scarf, pulled a shiny, golden pastry from a paper bag, flakes of it falling to the floor. The man looked away. His gaze drifted, as it often did, to the center of the concourse. There, standing under the vast, domed ceiling like a forgotten piece of furniture, was an old public piano. It was a beat-up upright, painted a cheerful, chipping yellow. A sign in cheerful letters invited, "Play me." Mostly, it was kids who banged on it, producing joyful, chaotic noise. Sometimes a brave teenager would pick out the first few bars of a pop song. For weeks, the man had watched it. His fingers, resting on his knees, would sometimes twitch, curling and flexing very slightly, as if tapping on an invisible surface. The station's clock ticked towards evening. The kiosks began to shudder their metal grills. One, a small bakery with a painted image of a smiling loaf of bread, was just closing. The baker, a stout man with a flour-dusted apron, was hauling a tray of unsold rolls and pastries from the front counter. The scent, warm and yeasty and sweet, cut through the station's smell of diesel and cleaning fluid. It hit the man on the bench like a physical force. He couldn't look away. He watched the baker move. He saw the man glance at a slightly squished brioche, shrug, and place it on a separate pile. Something in the man on the bench shifted. A decision, quiet and desperate, settled over him. It wasn't a grand plan. It was a simple animal need meeting a deep, buried memory. He pushed himself up from the bench, his joints stiff. He slung his backpack over one shoulder and walked, not with the rushing flow of the crowd, but across it. A slow, steady ship cutting against the current dot, he stopped in front of the bakery kiosk. The baker was counting coins in a metal box and didn't look up at first. The man waited. He cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound. The baker glanced up, his expression immediately shifting to one of mild annoyance. He saw the worn coat, the tired face. "We're closed," he said, his voice firm, not unkind but final. He went back to counting. "Please." The word was rough, barely more than a whisper. The baker sighed, a long-suffering sound. He looked up again, expecting a plea for money, a story about a train ticket. "I said closed? No handouts. Company policy." The man on the other side of the counter didn't ask for money. Instead, he slowly turned and pointed a finger, trembling slightly, toward the center of the hall. He pointed at the yellow piano dot the baker's brow, furrowed in confusion. What? The man took a shallow breath. His voice, when it came, was low and gravelly, each word pushed out with effort, as if he hadn't used it in a long time. "I can play," he said. Then he nodded toward the tray of leftover pastries. "I can play. For a piece of bread." For a long second, there was silence between them, filled only by the station's ambient roar. Then the baker's face changed. The annoyance melted away, replaced by something else, disbelief, and then amusement. A snort escaped him. He looked from the ragged man to the distant piano and back again. "You? Play?" He couldn't help it. A short, sharp laugh burst from him. "Come on, friend. Don't waste my time." The laugh was loud enough to catch the attention of a few passers-by. A young couple, dragging suitcases, slowed their step. A teenage boy with headphones paused, pulling one earpiece off. They saw a well-fed baker in his clean apron, laughing across the counter at a thin, shabby man. The dynamic was clear, the story obvious. The man was telling a tall tale, a ridiculous lie, to get some free food. A smile tugged at the lips of the teenage boy. The young woman whispered something to her partner, who smirked and shook his head. The scene was a tiny, amusing break in their journey. "Look at this guy," their expressions said. What a sad, silly attempt. The man did not react to the laughter. He didn't get angry. He didn't slink away in shame. He just stood there, absorbing it. The mockery seemed to wash over him, confirming something he already deeply knew about the world. His shoulders, already slumped, sank a fraction lower. But in his pale eyes, a tiny, stubborn light remained. It wasn't hope, not exactly. It was more like a last resort, a final card to be played. He simply looked at the baker, then at the small, gathering audience of smirks, and gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was an acceptance. An asterisk, all right. You don't believe me. I will show you. Asterisk without another word. He turned his back on the bakery kiosk, on the laughter, on the tray of pastries. He began to walk, slowly and deliberately, towards the yellow piano in the middle of the vast station floor. His footsteps were silent on the marble. The small audience, the baker, the teenager, the couple exchanged glances. The baker, chuckling, leaned on his counter, deciding to watch the show. This was better than counting coins. The teenager followed, a few steps behind, phone casually in hand, ready to capture the funny failure. The couple hesitated, then found a spot by a pillar, setting their suitcases down. It was a train wreck they couldn't look away from. The man reached the piano. He stood before it for a long moment, looking at it not as a piece of street furniture, but as an old, familiar thing. He placed his worn blue backpack carefully on the floor beside it. He then lowered himself onto the wooden piano stool, its surface scratched with initials and dates. He didn't rush. He sat perfectly still, his back to the audience, his head bowed slightly. He extended his hands. They were rough, the nails short and uneven, the skin marked with grime that wouldn't wash away. He held them over the keys, those chipped, off-white keys that had known so many clumsy touches. He didn't bring them down. He hovered. A man waiting for a bus sighed loudly, checking his watch. The baker folded his arms, a smile still playing on his face. The teenager raised his phone, recording. Then, the man on the stool closed his eyes. His whole body seemed to still, drawing in a long, deep breath that lifted his thin shoulders. For that one suspended moment, the chaotic noise of the station, the announcements, the footsteps, the laughter seemed to fade into a distant haze. There was only the man, the piano, and a profound waiting silence. And then his hands fell. The man's fingers, those rough and stained fingers, did not just press the keys. They descended upon them. It was not a timid tap, not the clumsy bang of a child. It was a deliberate, powerful motion, like a conductor bringing down his baton to begin a symphony. The sound that erupted from the old, yellow piano was not a single note. It was a deep, resonant, complicated chord. It was a sound so full of sorrow and beauty that it seemed to suck the air right out of the space around it. It was the low, rolling thunder of a coming storm, filled with aching melancholy. The chord hung in the vast station hall, vibrating in the marble and the steel, drowning out the hum of the crowd for one astonishing second. Every trace of a smile vanished from the baker's face. His folded arms dropped to his sides. The short, amused laugh that had been in his throat died instantly, replaced by a soft, involuntary gasp. He stood up straight, his eyes wide. His flour-dusted apron forgotten the teenager with the phone flinched, as if the sound had physically touched him. His finger, which had been ready to stop recording a joke, now gripped the phone tighter, pointing it steadily at the man's back. His other hand slowly came up and pulled the dangling headphone away from his ear, as if even that was too much interference. The young couple by the pillar froze. The woman's hand, which had been resting on her suitcase handle, tightened into a fist. Her partner's smirk was gone, his mouth slightly open. They didn't look at each other. They couldn't look away from the ragged figure on the stool. The chord faded, but the man did not pause. His left hand began a slow walking pattern down in the bass, a heartbeat of deep, steady notes. It was a pulse, a foundation of profound sadness. Then his right hand came in. The fingers, which had looked stiff and clumsy a moment before, now danced. They flew over the higher keys with a grace that seemed impossible. They weren't just hitting notes. They were weaving them. The melody that spilled out was haunting. A river of pure lyrical grief that twisted and turned, climbing to delicate, heartbreaking heights before falling back into the deep embrace of that left-hand pulse dot. It was Chopin. A nocturne. But to the people listening, it didn't matter what it was called. They didn't need to know the composer. The music spoke a language older than words. It spoke of loss, of beauty and darkness, of a lonely soul singing to an empty sky. The transformation in the station was slow but total. The river of people, which had been flowing with such purpose, began to stagnate. A man talking loudly on his phone fell silent, listening, then slowly ended his call. A group of tourists with backpacks stopped their chatter, turning their heads as one. A mother hushed her toddler, not with a word, but with a gentle hand on the head, both of them staring. A circle of space grew around the piano, as if the music itself was pushing people back to make room for its sorrow. No one wanted to break the spell by walking through it. They stood at the edges, motionless. Suitcases were set down. Coffee cups were held, forgotten, growing cold. Faces that had been bored, stressed, or impatient softened. Some stared in pure wonder. Others felt a sting in their eyes, a tightness in their throat they couldn't explain. The music touched some old, quiet place inside them they usually kept buried under the noise of the day. The baker felt a hot wave of shame wash over him, so intense it made his ears burn. His laughter, just moments ago, now felt like a crime, a vulgar shout in a sacred place. He looked at the man's thin back, the worn coat, and saw no joke. He saw a vessel, pouring out something so precious it hurt to listen. He thought of the tray of leftover pastries, of his dismissive words, company policy. He felt sick that the teenager's phone was still recording, but he was no longer thinking of it as a funny clip to share. He was documenting a miracle. The jaded, cool look was gone from his face, replaced by something like reverence. He'd heard music like this in movies, in headphones, played by world-famous artists. But this was here, now raw and real, coming from a man who lived on the streets. The contradiction was stunning. The man at the piano was gone. The person known as the homeless man on the bench had completely disappeared. In his place was a force of nature. His body moved with the music, not with wild gestures, but with a deep organic connection. He leaned into the sad phrases, his head bowing close to the keys. During a delicate, fluttering run of high notes, his right hand seemed to float weightless. His eyes remained closed. He was not playing for the baker, or the crowd, or for bread. He was somewhere far away, in a memory, in a feeling, and his hands were simply the channel, letting it all flow out through the dusty piano. He moved into a second piece. This one was different. It started softly, almost like a music box, a simple, innocent melody. But then his left hand stirred, introducing a low, restless rumbling. The innocence became complicated, chased by shadows. The music became stormy, passionate, full of conflict. It was Beethoven, a bagatelle that sounded like a struggle against a coming darkness. The man's fingers hammered the keys during the powerful sections, not with anger, but with a desperate intensity. The old piano shuddered under the force, but it held, giving back a rich, roaring sound that filled every corner of the station. A station security guard, who had been eyeing the gathering crowd with suspicion, walked over, ready to break up a disturbance. He reached the edge of the circle and stopped. His stern posture relaxed. He took off his cap and scratched his head, listening. After a minute, he simply stood there, his professional duty forgotten, captivated like everyone else. An elderly lady in a neat coat sat down on a nearby bench, her hands folded in her lap. A single tear traced a line through her powder. She didn't wipe it away. The music changed again, shifting back to something more lyrical, more unbearably sweet and sad. The man's control was absolute. The softest notes were whispers, felt more than heard, drawing the crowd in closer. The loudest were declarations that made people's hearts pound. He played for 10 minutes. It felt like a second and a lifetime. When the final piece drew to a close, a series of soft, fading chords that dissolved into silence, like mist, the effect was jarring. The last note lingered and then was gone, eaten by the normal sounds of the station that now seemed horribly loud and crude. A distant whistle, a squealing trolley wheel, a cough. The man's hands slowly lowered and came to rest in his lap. His shoulders slumped, the energy that had filled him now spent. He sat there, head still bowed, breathing slowly. He was back. The ragged, hungry man was back on the stool. For a few more seconds, the silence held. Then it wasn't silence. It was the absence of music. And it was broken not by applause, not at first. It was broken by the sound of the baker. The stout man was clambering out from behind his kiosk counter. He had the entire tray of leftover pastries in his hands, the brioches, the rolls, the croissants. He walked quickly and purposefully across the marble floor toward the piano. His face was flushed, his eyes bright. He didn't stop at the edge of the circle. He walked right up to the piano stool. The man looked up, his pale eyes tired, empty of expectation. The baker, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name, didn't speak. He simply held out the tray, a full offering. Not a piece of bread, everything. A few people in the crowd began to clap. Not a wild cheer, but a slow, deep, respectful applause. It spread, one person to another, until perhaps 50 people were clapping, the sound echoing softly under the great dome. It was not the applause for a performer on a stage. It was different. It was an apology. It was thanks. It was awe. The man at the piano looked at the tray, then at the baker's face. He saw no mockery now. He saw only stunned respect and that unspoken, burning shame. Very slowly, the man reached out. He didn't take the whole tray. He took a single plain roll from the corner. He nodded once, a small, tight movement. Then he stood up. The applause faltered, then stopped, unsure. He picked up his faded blue backpack from the floor, slung it over his shoulder, and without looking at anyone, he began to walk, not towards the exits, but back towards the cold stone benches at the side of the hall. He left the yellow piano behind, silent once more, but the station was changed. The people left behind, holding their cold coffees and their suitcase handles, looked at each other. No one laughed. They spoke in hushed tones. What was that? Who is he? The teenager stared at the video on his phone, knowing it was the most important thing he'd ever captured. The baker stood by the piano, tray still in hand, watching the thin figure walk away, understanding that the offer of bread had been the smallest thing in the room. The music had been the real gift, and they had almost missed it. The teenager's hands were shaking. He wasn't cold. The shaking came from inside, a buzzing energy left behind by the music. He stared at the small screen of his phone, at the video he had just recorded. The ragged back of the man, the dancing hands, the soul-wrenching sound, it was all there, trapped in digital form. It felt wrong, almost, to have captured something so raw. He had filmed it to laugh at it. Now, he felt like he was holding a secret, or maybe a stolen treasure. He didn't even think about it. His thumbs moved on their own. He posted the video. Not just anywhere. He put it on a site where things could spread. With a simple caption he typed out with clumsy fingers. Found this in the central station. Homeless guy asks for bread, then does this. He tagged the location. He hit share. Then, feeling like he needed to do something more, he looked up. The man was already a gray figure disappearing into the shadows near the benches. The teenager took a picture of the empty yellow piano, still and quiet, and posted that too. The baker watched the man go. The tray in his hands felt stupid and heavy. He placed it on the piano bench, the pastries untouched except for the one missing roll. He walked back to his kiosk in a daze, not seeing the familiar grill or the cash box. All he could see was the man's face when he had looked up, tired and empty. The baker's own cheeks burned with that same shame. He had offered the whole tray, but it felt like offering a pebble to a king. He closed the kiosk properly, his movements slow and mechanical. That night, he didn't tell his family about it. He couldn't find the words. He just said work had been strange. The video did not go viral in an hour. It simmered. A few people saw it that night. A woman on her couch, scrolling before bed, watched it and sat up straight. She shared it with the comment, "This is the most beautiful thing I've heard all week." A music student saw it and paused it, rewinding to watch the man's finger technique, his eyes wide with disbelief. "That's not just playing," he muttered to his empty room. "That's mastery." He shared it to a forum for classical musicians. By the next morning, it had begun to spread. The story was irresistible. The contrast was too powerful. The worn coat, the simple plea for bread, and then the waterfall of genius. It wasn't just a music video. It was a human puzzle. Who was he? Where did he come from? How did a man who played like a concert pianist end up on a station bench? Local news producers, always hunting for a feel-good story, saw the numbers climbing. A reporter and a camera person were sent to the station the next afternoon. They found the yellow piano. They interviewed the baker, who, once he started talking, found he couldn't stop. His words tumbled out, full of regret and wonder. "I laughed at him," he admitted to the camera, his face pained. "I actually laughed." "And then he played?" and I have never felt so small in my life. His honesty was more powerful than any script. They talked to the teenager, who showed them the exact spot. They spoke to a few commuters who had been there, who described the silence, the collective holding of breath. The story aired that evening. Not just the music, but the mystery. The maestro of the metro, the headline called him. A plea went out. Does anyone know this man? He did not see the news. He was back on his bench, the single role from the day before long gone. The world had shifted around him, but his world remained the same. The cold stone, the rumble of trains, the ache in his stomach. He noticed more people glancing at him, some with recognition in their eyes, but he looked away. He wanted no attention. The music had been a moment of weakness, of need. He regretted it now. It had torn open something he kept carefully sealed, that the answer to the mystery came from an unexpected place. An elderly woman was watching the news segment with her husband. When the camera showed a close-up of the man's profile as he played, his eyes closed in deep concentration, she gasped. She put a thin, veined hand to her mouth. "No," she whispered. "It can't be. What is it?" Her husband asked. "It's the eyes," she said. "And the way he holds his head? It's him. I'm sure of it." She had been a piano teacher for 40 years before retiring. A lifetime ago, she had taught at a prestigious music school for gifted children. And there had been one boy, a quiet, painfully shy boy, whose talent was not just a spark, but a roaring fire. He could play anything by ear. He understood music like others understand breathing. She found an old yearbook in a box in the spare room. Her fingers trembled as she turned the pages of faded photos. And there he was, a small, serious-faced boy of about 12, in a stiff suit, his hair neatly combed. The name underneath, Leo, just Leo. He had only been at the school for a few years. He was a prodigy, they said, destined for the great concert halls of Europe. But he was fragile. The pressure, the expectations, the staring eyes, they ate at him. Then, the teachers had whispered, there was a tragedy. His mother, his only parent, had passed away suddenly. The boy had broken. He played a final recital, a brilliant, stormy performance that left the audience in tears, and then he vanished from the music world completely. No one knew what became of him. He became a ghost story, teachers told. Whatever happened to young Leo? She called the news station. Her voice was shaky, but firm. "I know who he is," she said. The reporter met her, and she showed him the yearbook photo. The resemblance once pointed out was uncanny. The same deep-set eyes, the same curve of the cheek, aged by decades of hardship. The station, now with a name, dug deeper. They found old recital programs and archives. They tracked down a former classmate, now a middle-aged music shop owner. The classmate remembered Leo vividly. "He wasn't like the rest of us," the man said, sitting surrounded by violins and sheet music. "We practiced for hours to get things right. For him, it was just there. The music was in him, but he was a shadow. You'd say hello, and he'd flinch. The stage was his torture chamber. After his mother died, the light in him just went out. We heard he tried to study further, but it didn't work. He disappeared. We assumed he'd moved away, maybe found a quiet life teaching somewhere. But he hadn't. Piece by piece, the story came together, not as a neat biography, but as a series of fading echoes. There were records of him enrolling in a conservatory in another city, then leaving after one semester. A former landlord remembered a very quiet tenant who played the piano late into the night until other tenants complained. Then nothing. The trail went cold for years, until he appeared, like a stone washed up on a shore, in this very city, living on the streets. The immense talent had not died. It had gone into hiding with the man, buried under grief and fear. The news station prepared a follow-up story. This was no longer just a viral video. It was a lost and found tale of a human being. They wanted to find him again, to talk to him. But they also felt a new weight, a responsibility. This was not a stunt. This was a broken life. The reporter and camera person went back to the station, not to film the piano, but to search the benches, the quiet corners. They found him, sitting in his usual spot, staring at the same nothingness. The reporter, a young woman, approached slowly. She sat on the bench a little distance away, not thrusting a microphone in his face. "Hello," she said softly. He glanced at her, then away. He said nothing. "I? We know who you are," she said, even more gently. "We know you're Leo. From the school." At the sound of that old name, a name nobody had spoken to him in 30 years, he went very still. It was as if a door he had locked tight shuddered in its frame. He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it. He just sat frozen. "People saw you play," she continued. "They heard you. They want you to know." It was the most beautiful thing many of them have ever heard. He shook his head, a tiny, almost invisible movement. A rejection. Of the praise, of the memory, of it all. "We don't want to bother you," the reporter said, her voice sincere. "But your old teacher, she recognized you. She cares. A lot of people care." This seemed to cause him pain. He shifted on the bench, pulling his coat tighter around him, a gesture of closing up, of retreating. The reporter understood. She didn't push. She simply placed a business card on the bench between them. "If you ever want to talk, or if you need anything at all." She waited a moment longer, then stood up and walked away, leaving him alone with the ghost of his name. The camera person, who had stayed far back, zoomed in for a final shot. It wasn't of the man's face. It was of his hands. They rested on his knees, those ordinary, worn-looking hands. And as the camera watched, the fingers of his right hand began to move. Slowly, delicately, they pressed down on the fabric of his trousers, one after another, in a silent, perfect scale. Up and down. A private concert for no one. The music had never left. It had been playing inside him all this time, in the silence of his mind, on the invisible keyboard of his lap. He had always been playing. The world just hadn't been listening. The business card sat on the cold stone bench for a long time. A breeze from a passing train ruffled its edge. The man looked at it, then threw it. His name, spoken aloud after so many years, had felt like an intrusion. It was a key turning in a rusty lock to a room he had boarded up and forgotten. He did not pick up the card. He left it there, and eventually a cleaner swept it away with the dust and the ticket stubs. But the world outside his silence had changed. The follow-up news story aired. It wasn't sensational. It was quiet, respectful, and sad. They showed the old yearbook photo, the serious young boy. They interviewed his retired teacher, her eyes watery behind her glasses, her voice full of a gentle regret. "He had a gift that was a kind of burden," she said. "The light was too bright for him. I hope he knows the beauty he still carries." They didn't reveal his regular bench. They didn't ambush him again. They just told the story of Leo, the boy who vanished and the man who played for bread. And something in the way they told it, the lack of pressure, the tone of care rather than curiosity, softened the air around him. People began to recognize him, but differently now. It wasn't the starstruck gawking he feared. It was quieter. A woman walking to her train would slow, and instead of offering coins, she would leave a paper bag next to him on the bench. A sandwich, an apple, a bottle of water. She would walk away without a word. A station guard, the same one who had been ready to move him along days before, would sometimes nod to him as he passed, a silent acknowledgement that meant, "You can stay." The baker made it his personal mission. Every evening, as he closed his kiosk, he would take a fresh, still warm loaf of his best sourdough, wrap it in clean paper, and walk over to the man's usual spot. He wouldn't try to talk. He would just place it beside him, give a small, awkward nod, and leave. The first time, the man had stared at the loaf as if it were a complicated puzzle. The second time, he had given the baker the faintest glance. On the third evening, as the baker turned to go, a voice, rough and unused, stopped him. "Thank you." It was just 2 words, but they hit the baker like a physical force. He turned back, his throat tight. He just nodded again, unable to speak, and hurried away, his heart pounding with a strange, happy sorrow. The idea came from the retired teacher. She called the reporter. "We can't force him onto a stage," she said. "That would be the worst thing. But the music, he needs to let it out. It's killing him to keep it locked in. What if? What if we brought the stage to him? On his terms?" The reporter loved the idea. They worked with the station authorities, who, moved by the story, agreed. It was simple. They put up a small, discreet notice on the yellow piano one Friday evening. It read, "An informal evening of music. Tonight at 7 p.m. All are welcome to listen quietly." Word spread through the city, not as a viral event, but as a secret, a shared understanding. People told their friends in hushed tones. He might play again. At the station, just be respectful. As 7 o'clock approached, a crowd began to gather. But it was unlike any crowd the station had seen. There was no pushing, no noise. People stood in a wide, loose semicircle around the piano, leaving a big space. They spoke in whispers, if they spoke at all. The air was thick with a nervous, tender expectation. The baker was there, off to the side. The teenager was there, phone in pocket, determined just to listen this time. The retired teacher stood with her husband, her hand clasped in his. The man was on his bench. He had seen the notice. He had seen the people gathering. For an hour, he had wrestled with a deep old fear that clenched his stomach tighter than hunger ever had. The thought of all those eyes, all those expectations, made him want to vanish into the stone walls. But another feeling was there, too, weaker but persistent. It was the memory of the sound leaving him, the relief of it, like breathing after holding your breath for years. And the baker's bread, and the silent sandwiches, and the nod from the guard. A minute before 7, he stood up. A soft ripple went through the crowd, a collective inhale. He picked up his faded blue backpack and walked, not with confidence, but with the slow, heavy steps of a man walking towards a cliff edge. He kept his eyes on the floor. When he reached the piano, the silence in the great hall was absolute. You could hear the distant click of train tracks, the hum of the lights. He sat. He placed his backpack down. He looked at his hands in his lap. The crowd waited, not breathing. He didn't launch into Chopin this time. His fingers found the keys and began something slow, searching. It was a simple, melancholic melody, one he was making up as he went along. It was the sound of a cold bench at dawn. It was the sound of footsteps echoing in a lonely hall. It was the sound of remembering a mother's face. The music was raw, unpolished, and utterly, heartbreakingly personal. This was not a masterpiece from the past. This was his now. This was his story. Tears rolled down the retired teacher's cheeks. She heard the little boy she knew, lost inside the mandot as he played. Something in him began to loosen. The melody grew, weaving in threads of other tunes, a fragment of a lullaby, a strain of a stormy sonata he once loved. He opened his eyes, not to see the crowd, but to see the piano. He leaned into it, this old, battered, yellow friend. The music built, becoming more structured, more powerful. He transitioned into a real piece, a gentle, flowing work by Schumann, Shugumri or Dreaming. It was a piece full of innocence and a deep, wistful nostalgia. He played for 20 minutes. It was a journey, from solitary sorrow to fragile beauty, to a final piece that was surprisingly hopeful, a major key melody that rose like a slow sunrise. When he finished, his hands fell to his sides. He was exhausted, drained, but his face, for the first time, held a different kind of emptiness, not the void of despair, but the quiet hollow after a storm has passed. For a moment, nothing. Then the applause began. It didn't roar. It started with one person, then another, then the whole crowd. It was steady, warm, and sustained. It wasn't demanding more. It was saying thank you. Thank you for trusting us. Thank you for sharing the dream. He didn't run. He sat through it, accepting the sound, his head bowed. When it faded, he looked up, and for a brief second, his eyes scanned the faces in the front. He saw the baker, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. He saw the old teacher, giving him a small, tearful smile and a nod. He saw people not staring at a freak, but looking at him with something like gratitude. He stood up. He picked up his backpack. And then he did something he hadn't planned to do. He turned to face the crowd. He didn't smile, but he gave one slow, deep nod. It was an acknowledgement. A connection. As he walked back to his bench, a few people approached, but not too close. An older man in a neat coat said softly, "That was a gift, sir." "A true gift," a young mother whispered. "Thank you." The reporter approached him later, when the crowd had mostly dispersed. "Some people," she said carefully, "have asked if there's a way to help, properly, not just with food. There's a local arts charity. They have a small studio apartment. It's quiet. It's yours if you want it. No strings." He looked at her, wary. The walls inside him started to go up again. A home meant expectations, rules. "No strings," she repeated, understanding his fear. "It's just a room, with a lock, and a window. There's a small piano in the community room downstairs, if you ever want to play it. Or not. It's just there." He looked away, towards the dark mouth of the train tunnels. He thought of the cold nights coming. He thought of the endless, unwashed feeling. He thought of the piano downstairs, silent and waiting, not demanding anything. He looked back at the reporter and gave a single, barely perceptible nod. It wasn't a happy ending. It was a fragile beginning. He wasn't healed. The shy, broken boy was still inside the man. But that night, as he lay on his bench for what he hoped might be one of the last times, the noise in his head was quieter. The music, for now, was at peace. He had played it, and the world had not shattered. It had listened, and in that listening, he had found a sliver of something he thought was lost forever, a piece of himself. The room was on the 3rd floor of an old brick building that smelled of boiled cabbage and floor polish. It wasn't much. A single window looked out onto a quiet courtyard, not the busy street. There was a narrow bed, a small table, a chair, and a cupboard. A door that locked from the inside. For the first week, the man mostly used it for that. He would come in, lock the door, and sit on the bed, staring at the wall. The silence was different here. It wasn't the vast, echoing silence of the station. It was a small, close silence. It was his the arts charity. People were true to their word. They left him alone. A kindly woman from the office downstairs would leave a bag of basic groceries by his door every Monday: bread, milk, some fruit, tins of soup. She never knocked. He would wait until he heard her footsteps, retreat down the stairs before opening the door to retrieve it. The community room was on the ground floor. He avoided it for days, taking the stairs 2 at a time to rush past its closed door. He could sense the piano in there. It felt like a sleeping animal. His old bench at the station was now occupied by others. He went back once, out of habit, but it felt wrong. He was a ghost there now. People who recognized him would give a shy smile, but they didn't approach. The baker, however, saw him from his kiosk one afternoon and came rushing out, his face breaking into a wide, genuine grin. "You're not on the bench," the baker said, as if announcing a miracle. The man shook his head. "A room," he said, his voice still rough from disuse. The baker's eyes got shiny. "Good, that's good." He dashed back to his kiosk and returned with a paper bag. It wasn't yesterday's leftovers. It was a perfect, gold-encrusted loaf, still warm from the oven. "For your new place," the baker said, pressing it into his hands. The man took it. The warmth seeped through the paper into his cold fingers. "Thank you," he said. And this time, he almost meant it. The pull of the piano downstairs grew stronger, a quiet magnetic force. One rainy afternoon, when the building was especially quiet, he slipped into the community room. It was a shabby, friendly space with a sagging sofa, a bookshelf of donated paperbacks, and in the corner, an upright piano. It was brown, scratched, and older than the yellow one in the station. He sat on the bench. He didn't play. He just lifted the fallboard and looked at the keys. He placed his right hand on them and pressed down a single middle C. The note rang out, slightly out of tune, but clear. The sound lived in the small room, private and contained. There was no crowd to hear it. It was just for him. He began to visit the room at night when no one else was around. He would play for himself. Sometimes old, complicated pieces, his fingers remembering routes they had never forgotten. Sometimes just simple scales, feeling the mechanics of the hammers and strings. Sometimes he would try to play the sound of the rain on the courtyard stones. The locked door of the room upstairs and the late hour made it safe. The music was no longer a performance or a plea. It was a conversation with an old friend, the charity woman, whose name he never learned, but who had a gentle face, left a note for him one day with the groceries. It was written in careful handwriting. Some people at the community center next door run a small music group for children. They have a few old keyboards. They heard about you. They wondered if you might ever feel like just being around it. No pressure to teach, just to be there. The children are very loud, but kind. He threw the note away. The thought was terrifying. Children were noise and chaos and staring eyes. But a week later, on his way back from a walk, he heard the noise. It was coming from the building next door, a chaotic clatter of notes, mixed with giggles and the patient voice of an adult. He stood on the street, listening. It was awful music. It was beautiful. He found himself standing at the open door of the community center room. Inside, 6 or 7 children were gathered around 3 electronic keyboards. A flustered young volunteer was trying to show a small boy how to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. The boy was hitting all the wrong keys. Laughing, the man stood in the doorway, unseen. He watched the struggle. The memory was so distant, it felt like it belonged to someone else. The strict teacher, the metronome's tick, the fear of a wrong note. This was none of that. This was joy, and Mess. The volunteer looked up and saw him. Her eyes widened in recognition. She didn't say his name. She just smiled a little nervously and said, "It's a bit of a zoo in here." The small boy turned, following her gaze. He saw the thin, serious man in the doorway. "Mister," the boy said, "can you play it?" The man froze. All the old fears rushed back. But the room was so small, so ordinary. This wasn't a concert hall. It was a messy room with crayon drawings on the walls. He took a step inside, then another. He walked over to the boy's keyboard. He didn't sit. He leaned over and with one finger, very slowly, played the simple melody. Correctly. Clearly. The boy's face lit up. Yeah, like that. Your turn, the man said, his voice a dry whisper. He pointed to the keys. Start here. He didn't go back the next week, or the week after. But on the third week, he found himself outside the door again. This time, he went in and sat on a chair in the corner. He didn't play. He just watched. A little girl, struggling with her left hand, kept getting mixed up. Without thinking, he got up, stood behind her, and very gently guided her small finger to the right key. This one, he said. That became his place. The chair in the corner. He was not a teacher. He was the quiet man who sometimes showed you which key was which. Who would, if a child really asked, play a complicated version of their simple song that made them gasp and giggle. He never smiled much, but the tight, pained look around his eyes began to soften, like ice slowly melting. He still played at night in the community room. Word got around the neighborhood. Sometimes, if the window was open, people walking through the courtyard would slow their steps to listen. They never clapped. They just listened for a minute in the dark, then walked on, the music trailing after them. One Sunday, the baker came to visit him, a little awkwardly carrying a bag of pastries. The man led him into the small room. They sat at the table. The baker talked about his kiosk, about his family. The man listened, nodding. He made tea on the small hot plate. It was the first time he had hosted a guest in over 20 years. The piano at the station, the baker said finally. It's different now. People still play it. But sometimes, when it's quiet, I remember that first chord. It changed everything. The man looked into his tea. It changed nothing, he said quietly. And everything. The baker understood. The man was still the same wounded soul. He still had his silent days, his moments of distant sorrow. He would probably always carry that weight. But he was no longer drowning. He had found a place where his feet could touch the bottom. The story of the piano genius faded from the news. He became a local legend, a gentle mystery. People in the neighborhood would point him out sometimes. That's him, you know, the pianist. But they said it softly, and they never bothered him. His life was small, and that was its gift. A room that was his. A piano he could visit at night. The chaotic, joyful noise of children learning scales next door. The weekly loaf of bread, delivered not out of pity, but from friendship. He never went back to play the yellow piano in the station. But one evening, walking home, he took a detour through the great hall. It was late. The station was quiet. The yellow piano stood alone under the dimmed lights. He walked past it, his hands in his pockets. He didn't stop. He didn't need to. He had his own keys now. To a door, to a life. The music was no longer a ghost haunting the halls of a train station. It had found a home. It was in the late-night scales in a shabby community room, in the gentle correction of a child's finger, in the warm smell of fresh bread in a small, quiet apartment. It was finally just for him. And in being just for him, it became a gift he could finally, slowly begin to share.